September 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 4 months, but in occupied Germany, a different kind of battle is just beginning. Lieutenant James Henderson of the United States Army stands outside a ruined apartment building in Frankfurt, holding a bouquet of wilted flowers he traded his cigarette rations to obtain. Inside, on the 3rd floor of a building with no electricity and half its walls missing, waits Margarete Schulz, a 23-year-old German woman who speaks almost no English. Their relationship violates General Eisenhower's direct order forbidding fraternization between American soldiers and German civilians. If discovered, Henderson faces court-martial. Margarete faces something worse, the wrath of her starving neighbors who call women like her Ami-Liebchen, American sweethearts, a term dripping with contempt and accusation of betrayal. This is not a story anyone wanted told. Not the American military, which saw these relationships as security risks and moral failures. Not the German population, which viewed these women as traitors sleeping with the enemy for food and protection. Not even the couples themselves, who understood that their love was born from the ashes of the worst conflict in human history, a fact that would haunt them for decades. But it happened anyway. Between 1945 and 1950, approximately 15,000 German women married American soldiers and immigrated to the United States, despite official policies designed to prevent exactly this outcome. Their stories reveal something that military strategists and political theorists rarely account for in their calculations: that human connection can transcend ideology, that love can bloom in the ruins of hatred, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through policy or propaganda, but through the simple act of two people choosing each other against all logic and reason. To understand why these marriages were so controversial, we must first understand the world these couples inhabited in 1945. Germany was not just defeated, it was destroyed in ways that challenge modern comprehension. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced major cities to moonscapes of rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, cities that had stood for centuries were now landscapes of broken stone and twisted metal. In Berlin alone, 400 million cubic meters of rubble choked the streets. 75% of the city's buildings were damaged or destroyed. The population that remained, predominantly women, children, and elderly men, lived in cellars and subway tunnels, emerging to dig through ruins for anything salvageable. The demographic catastrophe was staggering in its scope. Germany had lost approximately 5 million military personnel during the war, the vast majority of them men of marriageable age. Add to this the millions of men held in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, those missing and presumed dead in the chaos of the war's end, and those permanently disabled by combat injuries. And the result was a society where women outnumbered men by ratios that approached 3 to 1 in some age groups. Cities like Berlin had populations that were 70% female. Young women who should have been marrying and starting families found themselves in a society where suitable partners simply did not exist in sufficient numbers. The food situation had collapsed beyond mere scarcity into systematic starvation. Official rations in the British and American occupation zones provided between 900 and 1,200 calories daily, less than half of what human beings need to maintain basic health. In reality, distribution was so chaotic that many civilians received far less. Women traded family heirlooms for single potatoes. Children with distended bellies from malnutrition begged American soldiers for chocolate. The black market became the only functional economy, with cigarettes serving as currency more reliable than the worthless Reichsmark. A single pack of American cigarettes could buy food for a week. A carton could secure a month's rent or items of significant value. The winter of 1945 to 1946, known as the Hunger Winter, killed thousands through starvation and cold. Women foraged in forests for anything edible, stripping bark from trees, digging for roots in frozen ground, eating plants that caused illness, but at least provided something to fill empty stomachs. Urban populations had no access to gardens or farms, depending entirely on ration systems that were failing catastrophically. The mortality rate among elderly and very young spiked dramatically, as the most vulnerable succumbed to conditions that healthy societies would have prevented. Into this apocalyptic landscape came 4 million American soldiers as occupiers of a defeated enemy nation. The American military, having just defeated Nazi Germany at tremendous cost, was not inclined toward sympathy. General Eisenhower issued strict non-fraternization orders almost immediately. No speaking to German civilians except in line of duty. No social interaction. No sharing of rations or supplies. No relationships of any kind. The policy had multiple justifications. Security concerns about German resistance movements or intelligence gathering. Moral objections to American soldiers cavorting with the enemy while Allied prisoners were still being repatriated from German camps. Political calculations about how fraternization would appear to Allied nations who had suffered under German occupation. The policy included specific prohibitions that revealed American military anxiety about soldier behavior, no shaking hands with Germans, no playing games or sports with German civilians, no attendance at German cultural events or social gatherings, no gifts or assistance of any kind. Violation carried penalties ranging from fines to court-martial depending on severity. Military police were assigned to enforce these rules, patrolling areas where soldiers and civilians might interact, investigating reports of fraternization with the zeal of morality police. The policy was doomed from the start because it assumed that human beings, especially young men far from home who had just survived the trauma of combat, would behave according to military regulations rather than human nature. American soldiers, many of them teenagers or barely into their 20s, found themselves in a destroyed country populated primarily by young women whose husbands and boyfriends were dead, missing, or imprisoned. The women were hungry, desperate, and in many cases grateful that the occupation was American rather than Soviet. The soldiers had food, cigarettes, chocolate, and access to goods that didn't exist in the German economy. The ingredients for connection were all present. Regardless of what military regulations said about fraternization, by October 1945, just 5 months after the war's end, the non-fraternization policy was being violated so systematically that enforcement became impossible. Reports from military police documented thousands of infractions daily. Soldiers shared rations with hungry children, which led to conversations with grateful mothers. They hired German women as housekeepers and laundresses, which created daily contact that sometimes developed into friendship or more. They attended black market operations where American goods were traded for German services. Transactions that required interaction, the policy explicitly forbade. The policy was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, impossible to maintain in the face of human nature and practical necessity. Military leadership faced a choice between admitting the policy had failed or court-martialing such large numbers of soldiers that military discipline would collapse entirely. They chose a middle path, quietly scaling back enforcement while maintaining official prohibitions, creating a gray area where relationships could develop as long as they remained discreet enough to allow plausible deniability. This unofficial tolerance allowed thousands of relationships to form in late 1945 and early 1946, creating facts on the ground that would eventually force official policy changes. The early relationships formed in this environment were complicated by power dynamics that cannot be ignored or romanticized. German women faced starvation and homelessness. American soldiers controlled access to food, employment, and protection. Some relationships were undoubtedly transactional, survival mechanisms rather than genuine emotional connections. The German population coined bitter terms for these women. Veronika Dankeschön, Veronica thank you, for women who traded sexual favors for cigarettes or chocolate. Ami-Liebchen, American sweethearts, a designation that carried implications of collaboration and betrayal. Chocolate Fräulein, for obvious reasons. The contempt was vicious and gendered, directed entirely at the women while the American soldiers faced no equivalent social stigma. German men, when they returned from prisoner of war camps or military service, expressed rage at finding their sisters, former girlfriends, or female neighbors involved with American soldiers. Incidents of violence against these women were common enough that military authorities issued warnings about German men attacking fraternizing women. Some women had their heads forcibly shaved, a punishment with deliberate echoes of how French women who had collaborated with German occupiers had been treated. Others faced social ostracism so complete that they could not obtain housing or employment without American assistance. The hatred was not abstract or theoretical, but visceral and immediate, making these relationships dangerous in ways that went beyond military discipline. But amid the transactions and survival strategies, something else emerged that military planners had not anticipated. Genuine relationships formed between individuals who saw past uniforms and nationality to recognize shared humanity. James Henderson met Margarete Schulz not through deliberate courtship, but through bureaucratic accident. He was assigned to assist with civilian food distribution in Frankfurt, checking lists and managing queues of hungry Germans receiving their inadequate rations. Margarete worked as a translator for the distribution center, one of the few German civilians employed by the occupation authorities because she spoke functional English learned from a British governess before the war. Their first conversation was purely professional, Henderson asking about discrepancies in the distribution lists, Margarete explaining how the German naming conventions had confused the American record keepers. But Henderson noticed things: that she gave her own rations to elderly women in the queue, that she worked 12-hour shifts without complaint despite obvious malnutrition, that she spoke to everyone with dignity, even the Americans she had been taught to hate, even the German civilians who muttered insults about her collaboration. He started bringing extra rations from the American mess hall, claiming he couldn't finish his portions, leaving them where she would find them. She started staying late to help him with paperwork, teaching him German phrases, correcting his pronunciation with gentle patience. The relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of them aware that discovery meant disaster. They met in the ruins of bombed buildings where no one would see them. They walked through rubble-strewn parks at dawn before the streets filled with civilians and military police. They shared stories of their lives before the war, finding unexpected commonalities. Henderson had grown up on a farm in Iowa, the son of German immigrants who had Americanized their name from Hendershite in the previous generation. Margaret's father had been a professor of literature, shot by the Gestapo in 1944 for making defeatist remarks after Stalingrad. They had both lost siblings. His brother died at Normandy. Her sister disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall to Soviet forces. By October 1945, Henderson had decided he wanted to marry Margarete, a decision that was legally impossible and practically insane. The non-fraternization policy was still in effect. Marriage between American soldiers and German nationals was explicitly forbidden. Even if the policy changed, the logistics were nightmarish. He would be rotated back to the United States within months. She had no passport, no visa, no means of following him. His family in Iowa had lost a son to German bullets and would not welcome a German daughter-in-law. Her neighbors already called her a traitor and would increase their persecution if she married an American. Every rational consideration argued against this course of action. He proposed anyway, in broken German, in the ruins of the Frankfurt Opera House on a December evening when snow covered the rubble and made the destruction almost beautiful. She said yes, in English, understanding exactly what they were choosing and what it would cost them both. They had no ring because Henderson couldn't afford one, and Margarete had sold all her jewelry for food months earlier. They had no legal path to marriage because military regulations prohibited it. They had only the certainty that they wanted to face whatever came next together rather than apart. Meanwhile, 200 miles north in Hamburg, a different story was unfolding with a different outcome. Private William Morrison from Tennessee had met Elise Brandt in November 1945 when she approached him begging for food for her mother, who was dying from tuberculosis, complicated by starvation. Morrison, moved by her desperation, brought medical supplies and rations from the American hospital where he worked. He visited regularly over the following weeks, ostensibly checking on the mother's condition, actually falling in love with the daughter who cared for her with devotion that reminded him of his own sisters back home. The mother died in January 1946, and Morrison proposed marriage almost immediately, driven by a combination of genuine feeling and savior complex that complicated his motivations in ways he didn't fully understand. Elise accepted, seeing in this Tennessee farm boy her only realistic chance at survival, in a city where young women without family or resources faced grim prospects. Their relationship was built on affection and mutual need, rather than deep knowledge or shared experience, a foundation that would prove insufficient for what came after. Morrison, like Henderson, applied for marriage permission under the revised regulations that had replaced the strict non-fraternization ban. But Morrison's application faced different obstacles because Elise's father had been a mid-level Nazi Party official, killed during the war, but his membership creating bureaucratic red flags that delayed approval for months. Investigators questioned whether Elise herself held Nazi sympathies, whether her late father's connections created security risks, whether Morrison was being manipulated by a woman using him for immigration purposes. The interrogations were harsh and accusatory, reducing Elise to tears multiple times, forcing her to denounce her father and everything he had believed in, demanding proof of anti-Nazi sentiment that was impossible to provide after years of living under. Regime that punished dissent. Permission was eventually granted with extensive conditions requiring additional background checks and monitoring that other couples didn't face. Morrison and Elise married in March 1946, and he was rotated back to Tennessee in June, beginning a separation that would last 18 months and end in divorce rather than reunion. The letters between them, preserved in Morrison's effects after his death and donated to university archives, document a relationship dissolving across distance and cultural misunderstanding. Elise wrote in German that Morrison couldn't read, forcing her to find translators for intimate correspondence, creating distance through the very act of communication. She described her isolation in Hamburg, her inability to find work because of her father's Nazi past, her growing depression as the separation stretched indefinitely. Morrison wrote cheerful letters about Tennessee that revealed no understanding of her situation, suggesting she would love American small-town life while demonstrating no awareness that she was starving in the ruins of a defeated nation waiting for immigration papers that might never arrive. By late 1947, Elise's letters became desperate, begging Morrison to send money, to expedite the immigration process, to do anything to end the waiting that was destroying her. Morrison's responses became defensive and eventually angry, accusing her of only wanting him for his American citizenship, suggesting she should be more patient and grateful for his efforts on her behalf. The relationship had devolved into recrimination and resentment, love unable to survive the strain of separation, bureaucratic obstacles, and fundamental incompatibility that wartime circumstances had hidden. Elise never came to America. She withdrew her immigration application in 1948 and married a German widower in 1950, building a life in rebuilt Hamburg that bore no resemblance to the American future she had imagined. Morrison returned to Tennessee bitter about what he viewed as betrayal, telling family and friends that German women couldn't be trusted, that his marriage had been a mistake born from wartime confusion. Neither version told the complete truth, which was that two people under impossible circumstances had tried to build connection across unbridgeable differences and failed in ways that were tragic but also predictable. The Morrison-Brandt story represented one end of the war bride experience spectrum, Henderson and Schulz, who would eventually succeed in their immigration and marriage, represented the other end. Between these poles existed thousands of variations, couples who navigated the challenges with different resources, different obstacles, and wildly different outcomes. What came next for the successful couples was a policy change driven by reality overtaking regulation. By late 1945, thousands of American soldiers were involved in relationships with German women, and the non-fraternization policy was being violated so systematically that enforcement was impossible. Military police couldn't arrest half the occupation force. The policy was quietly revised in December 1945, allowing social interaction with German civilians and, eventually, marriages with command approval. But approval was deliberately difficult to obtain, requiring extensive background checks, interviews, and military reviews designed to discourage all but the most determined couples. The War Brides Act of 1945 had been passed to facilitate immigration of European women who married American servicemen, primarily addressing British and French war brides who faced fewer social and political obstacles than German women. The act technically applied to German brides as well, but implementation revealed bureaucratic hostility that made the process excruciating. Applications required documentation that war-torn Germany struggled to produce, birth certificates from cities whose records had burned in bombing raids, police background checks from jurisdictions that no longer functioned, medical examinations that required health standards malnourished. Women couldn't meet without months of proper nutrition that wasn't available. Henderson began the application process in January 1946, submitting to interrogations about Margarette's wartime activities, her family's political affiliations, her motivations for wanting to marry an American. Investigators questioned her neighbors, her former employers, anyone who had known her during the Nazi period. They were looking for any evidence of Nazi Party membership, any indication that this was a marriage of convenience designed to gain American citizenship, any reason to deny the application. Margarete endured hours of questioning about her political beliefs, her feelings about the war, whether she had participated in Nazi youth organizations, a requirement for all German children during the regime's rule. The interrogations revealed the impossible position these women occupied. Investigators demanded proof they had opposed the Nazi regime, but such opposition had been punished by death during the regime's rule, making resistance impossible to document. They wanted evidence of anti-Nazi sentiment, but expressing such views during the war had meant imprisonment or worse. The women were asked to prove retroactive resistance to a system that had punished resistance, creating catch-22 situations where there were no good answers. Margarette's interrogation was particularly difficult because her father's execution by the Gestapo created ambiguous evidence. On one hand, his death proved anti-Nazi beliefs in the family. On the other hand, his role as university professor raised questions about why he hadn't been arrested earlier if he was genuinely oppositional. Investigators suggested he might have been executed for other reasons, that his family might be hiding true political affiliations. Margarete was forced to describe her father's death in detail, reliving trauma while strangers took notes and questioned whether she was telling the truth. The investigation took 6 months, during which Henderson faced constant pressure from his superiors to abandon the relationship. His commanding officer called him into the office multiple times, pointing out that Henderson's military career would suffer if he persisted with this marriage, that he could find a nice American girl back home who wouldn't carry the baggage of enemy nationality, that Margarete was probably using him for access to America and would abandon him once she obtained citizenship. The arguments combined concern with contempt, suggesting that any German woman willing to marry an American soldier so soon after the war must be morally compromised. Henderson refused to withdraw his application, and in July 1946, permission was granted with the bureaucratic terseness that characterized military communication. Approval for marriage granted. Subject: Margarete Elisabeth Schulz. No ceremony assistance provided. Immigration processing separate. They married in a Frankfurt registry office with 2 witnesses pulled from the street. A ceremony that lasted 9 minutes and was conducted in German that Henderson barely understood and English that Margarete struggled to follow. They had no reception because they had no money and no friends who would celebrate a union that both American military culture and German civilian society viewed with disapproval. They spent their wedding night in Henderson's cramped military quarters, technically violating housing regulations that prohibited German civilians from entering American facilities. The marriage solved nothing in practical terms. Margarete was now legally Henderson's wife, but still a German national with no right to enter the United States. Henderson was scheduled for rotation back to Iowa in 3 months, and there was no mechanism for bringing foreign spouses along with returning soldiers. The immigration processing that should have begun immediately after marriage approval was instead delayed by bureaucratic bottlenecks that seemed deliberately punitive. Applications sat in administrative limbo for months. Requests for status updates went unanswered. The process that had been advertised as streamlined for war brides turned out to be Byzantine and hostile for German applicants specifically. Henderson was sent back to the United States in October 1946, forced to leave his wife behind in occupied Germany, with a promise that he would find a way to bring her to America, though neither of them knew how that would actually happen. The separation was agonizing and uncertain. International mail service was unreliable. Letters took weeks to arrive if they arrived at all. Henderson sent money when he could, but currency exchange was complicated and expensive. Margarete waited in Frankfurt, living on his irregular payments and working whatever jobs she could find in an economy that was slowly rebuilding but still offered little opportunity for women without connections or resources. The uncertainty created by separation drove thousands of couples to desperate measures. Some American soldiers went AWOL, refusing orders to return to the United States without their wives, hiding in the ruins of German cities until military police dragged them back to face court-martial. Private Robert Chen from California deserted in November 1946, living with his German wife Hannelore in the rubble of Munich for 3 months before being captured. He served 6 months in military prison before being dishonorably discharged, returning to the United States with a criminal record that would haunt his employment prospects for years. Hannelore eventually joined him in 1948, but their marriage never recovered from the trauma of his imprisonment and the poverty that followed his discharge. Some German wives attempted illegal immigration, stowing away on military transport ships or using forged documents to enter American occupation zones with better immigration processing. Maria Schmidt from Stuttgart paid black market operators to create false papers identifying her as French rather than German, hoping French nationality would ease immigration barriers. She was discovered during processing in Bremerhaven and imprisoned for 6 weeks before being released and blacklisted from legal immigration for 5 years. Her American husband, Sergeant Thomas Wheeler, divorced her in 1947, unable to maintain the relationship after her criminal conviction. Some couples gave up entirely. The relationship unable to survive the combination of distance, bureaucratic obstacles, and social pressure from both sides. Statistical analysis from immigration records suggests that approximately 30% of approved marriages never resulted in the German wife immigrating to America, relationships dissolving during the separation period or bureaucratic process. The numbers represented thousands of failed marriages, love unable to overcome structural barriers designed to prevent exactly these unions. Henderson and Margarete's separation lasted 14 months, during which Henderson worked 2 jobs in Iowa to save money for her passage and nagged every government office he could find about expediting her immigration papers. He wrote letters to his congressman, to the State Department, to military officials who might have influence over the process. He filled out forms until his hand cramped, submitted documentation that was repeatedly lost or deemed insufficient, and waited through delays that seemed deliberately punitive. His family provided no support. His mother refusing to speak to him about the German wife she considered a mistake that would ruin his life. His father suggesting tersely that Henderson should consider the marriage a wartime folly best forgotten. In December 1947, Margarete's immigration papers finally cleared all the bureaucratic hurdles. She received notification to report to Bremen Port for transport to the United States aboard a military vessel converted for spouse transportation. She owned almost nothing, having sold or traded most of her possessions during the years of scarcity. She packed a single suitcase with clothes, a photograph of her parents, and a small volume of Goethe poems that had somehow survived the war. She said goodbye to no one because she had no friends left in Frankfurt. The women she had known before the war, having either died, fled to other zones, or stopped speaking to her when she married an American. The transport ship that carried Margarete and 600 other German war brides to New York in January 1948 was the former troop carrier, USS General Stuart Heinzelmann, reconfigured to accommodate civilian passengers in conditions that were better than wartime troop transport, but still austere and uncomfortable. The women were housed in converted cargo holds with triple-stacked bunks and minimal privacy, washing facilities shared among dozens, meals served in shifts in mess halls that reminded everyone this was military rather than civilian passage. The journey took 9 days across winter Atlantic seas that were rough enough to keep most passengers seasick and frightened for the entire crossing. Many of these women had never seen the ocean before, much less sailed across it in a vessel that pitched and rolled through storms that made even experienced sailors uncomfortable. They huddled in their bunks, vomiting into shared buckets, crying for homes they were leaving and uncertain futures they were approaching, bound together by shared terror and shared hope. But the voyage also created community among women who would otherwise have faced their transformation in isolation. They shared stories, comparing their soldiers, their struggles to get approval, their fears about America. They traded English phrases, practicing pronunciation and grammar, preparing for a country where their accents would mark them as foreign and possibly hostile. They formed friendships that would last decades, connections forged in shared circumstances that created bonds stronger than those of easier times. Greta Hoffmann from Berlin, traveling to join her husband in Alabama, spoke fluent English learned from her British mother, and became unofficial teacher for women who knew only basic phrases. She conducted daily language lessons in the cargo hold, drilling pronunciation and idioms, preparing her classmates for the linguistic challenges ahead. Her lessons went beyond language to cultural education, explaining American customs and expectations as she understood them from her husband's letters and her own mixed Anglo-German heritage. Ingrid Weber, from Hamburg, joining her husband in Wyoming, had worked as a seamstress before the war and spent the voyage altering clothes for women whose wardrobes had been assembled from charity donations and black market purchases. She took in waists and hemmed skirts, transforming ill-fitting garments into something approaching respectability. Understanding that first impressions in America would matter more than these women realized. She worked without charge, accepting only traded items when others insisted, building social capital that would prove valuable when she needed help in her own adjustment. The ship's American crew treated the women with mixture of curiosity and contempt, some sailors friendly and helpful, others making crude jokes about German women and American men, questioning why any soldier would marry the enemy. The chaplain assigned to the voyage gave a sermon about Christian forgiveness that seemed directed at the crew rather than the passengers, reminding Americans that these women were not responsible for Nazi atrocities, that they deserved respect as future American citizens. The sermon fell on mixed reception, some crew members nodding agreement, others exchanging skeptical looks that suggested forgiveness wasn't their primary sentiment. Margarete wrote in a diary she kept during the crossing, entries preserved in her granddaughter's possession and later donated to an oral history project. The other women ask me what my husband is like. what his family is like, whether America is truly as wealthy as the soldiers claim. I do not know how to answer because I barely know James beyond our stolen moments in Frankfurt. We married in chaos and separated almost immediately. I am traveling to a country I have never seen to live with a man I have known for less than 2 years, most of that time spent apart. This should terrify me more than it does. Perhaps I am too numb from everything else to feel appropriate fear. Or perhaps after losing everything else, I have learned to accept uncertainty as the only constant. The ship arrived at New York Harbor in January 1948, and the women got their first glimpse of America through the winter haze. The Manhattan skyline rising impossibly tall and intact, buildings that actually had roofs and windows, and electric lights glowing in the dusk. After years in ruined German cities where 3-story buildings were considered miraculously preserved, the scale of New York was incomprehensible. The women crowded the railings, pointing and exclaiming, some crying at the sight of a city that hadn't been bombed, hadn't been destroyed, stood magnificent and whole in ways that European cities no longer did. The immigration processing at Ellis Island took hours. Each woman interviewed about her background, her marriage, her intentions in America. Medical examinations checked for tuberculosis and other communicable diseases that were endemic in post-war Europe. Blood tests screened for syphilis, a requirement that outraged some women who viewed it as insulting suggestion of moral compromise. Chest X-rays revealed lung damage from years of inadequate nutrition and exposure to cold and damp in damaged buildings. Some women were quarantined immediately upon discovery of active tuberculosis. Some were denied entry despite having traveled all the way across the Atlantic, medical conditions disqualifying them from immigration under public health regulations. Anna Kristen from Munich was turned away because tuberculosis had advanced too far for treatment in outpatient settings, requiring hospitalization that immigration services refused to provide. Her American husband, waiting at the reception area with flowers, watched helplessly as she was loaded back onto the ship for return to Germany. They would try again a year later after treatment in German sanitarium, but the relationship couldn't survive a second separation, and they divorced in 1950 without ever living together as husband and wife in America. Margarete passed all the checks and was released to find James waiting in the reception area, standing with dozens of other men holding flowers and handmade signs, scanning the crowd of exhausted women for familiar faces. Their reunion was awkward at first, 14 months of separation having created a strangeness between them that physical presence didn't immediately overcome. He had gained weight from regular American meals. She looked gaunt, despite the ship's food having been better than anything she had eaten in years. They embraced carefully, conscious of observers and of how much had changed since their last contact. The train journey from New York to Iowa took 2 days. Crossing through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, states Margarete had only seen on maps, landscapes she struggled to comprehend through the train window. America had not been bombed. There were no ruins. Houses stood intact with paint and shutters and landscaped gardens. Towns had shops with goods displayed in windows. People dressed in clean clothes and appeared well-fed, casually abundant in ways that seemed obscene after the deprivation of post-war Germany. She watched silently, unable to articulate her reactions, experiencing the cognitive dissonance of moving from scarcity to surplus almost overnight. Other war brides on different trains traveling to different destinations experienced similar shock at American abundance. Liesl Mueller, heading to Texas to join her husband on a cattle ranch, wrote letters to her sister in Germany, describing landscapes that sounded like fantasy. The fields stretch for miles without a single bomb crater. Houses have glass in all their windows. Children are fat, actually fat, playing in yards without begging for food. I keep waiting for the destruction to appear, for the familiar ruins that marked every German city. But they never come. America was not touched by this war in ways that make it almost impossible to believe we were fighting the same. Conflict. The regional diversity of America revealed itself as these women dispersed across the country to join husbands in locations that varied wildly in their reception and resources. German war brides arrived in New York penthouses and Kansas farmhouses, in California suburbs and Louisiana bayou communities, in industrial cities and rural towns, facing circumstances as different as the landscapes they inhabited. In the American South, German war brides faced particular hostility layered with regional attitudes about race, class, and propriety that complicated their integration in ways that northern communities didn't replicate. Martha Schneider, arriving in rural Georgia in 1948 to join her husband on a cotton farm, discovered that being white and European didn't exempt her from Southern social hierarchies that viewed outsiders with deep suspicion. The community treated her with coldness that bordered on cruelty, women refusing to include her in church groups or social gatherings, merchants providing slow service while chatting warmly with local customers, children taunting her accent on the rare occasions she appeared in town. But Martha also discovered unexpected alliance with black sharecroppers who worked the surrounding farms, people who recognized in her isolation something familiar from their own experiences of exclusion. An elderly black woman named Essie May brought her food during her first difficult weeks, explaining quietly that she knew what it felt like to be unwelcome in your own home. The friendship that developed was necessarily secret, Southern racial codes making open friendship between white woman and black woman socially impossible, but it provided Martha with connection that sustained her through the worst of her isolation. In contrast, Helena Wagner, arriving in San Francisco in 1949, found urban Northern California relatively welcoming. The cosmopolitan port city, accustomed to ethnic diversity and less inclined toward hostility based purely on national origin. She secured employment in a German restaurant in the city's immigrant neighborhood, working alongside other European refugees, living in a boarding house populated by recent arrivals from multiple countries. Her experience of America was fundamentally different from Martha's. Urban anonymity and ethnic community, providing buffer against discrimination that rural areas didn't offer. Henderson tried to prepare Margarete for his family's reception, explaining carefully that his mother had not accepted the marriage and might not be welcoming, that his father was reserved and would need time to warm to her, that the small Iowa farming community would view her with suspicion and possibly hostility. Margarete listened and nodded, and understood that she was about to become an outsider again, her German accent and foreign mannerisms marking her as enemy even in her husband's hometown. The Henderson family farm sat outside a town of 2,000 people, most of whom had some connection to the war through service or loss. Henderson's mother greeted them at the door with cold politeness, speaking to her son, but not acknowledging Margaret's presence, setting the tone for what would be years of difficult coexistence. His father shook Margaret's hand with grudging courtesy, his expression making clear that he considered this marriage a mistake, but would tolerate it because his son had made his choice. The brother who had survived the war, older than James, and bearing scars from the Pacific Theater, looked at Margarete with barely concealed anger, and then refused to speak to her for the next 3 years. Margarete moved into the farmhouse as a stranger in hostile territory, her presence resented by most of the family and much of the community. She spoke English with a heavy accent that marked her as German in every conversation, triggering reactions that ranged from cold silence to active hostility. At church, women who had lost sons or husbands to German bullets refused to sit near her. At the general store, service was slow and grudging, clerks taking their time while other customers were served first. Children followed her on the street, sometimes throwing stones, always chanting variations of Nazi and Kraut and go home. The isolation was comprehensive and deliberate, the community making clear that enemy nationality was not forgiven simply because she had married an American. Henderson tried to shield her from the worst of it, but he worked long hours on the farm, and couldn't always be present when neighbors expressed their displeasure. His mother's coldness was constant and corrosive, criticizing Margaret's cooking, her housekeeping, her English, finding fault with everything she did while maintaining superficial civility that made direct confrontation impossible. Margarete adapted by becoming nearly invisible, speaking as little as possible, avoiding situations that might trigger conflict, performing farm work with German efficiency that slowly earned grudging respect, if not acceptance. She learned American cooking by watching Henderson's mother, mastering recipes that bore no resemblance to German cuisine. She practiced English relentlessly, listening to radio programs and reading newspapers, determined to eliminate the accent that marked her as foreign. She wrote letters to the other war brides she had met on the transport ship, women scattered across America facing similar isolation and hostility, creating a network of support that understood what civilian Americans could